In the unforgiving expanse of the American frontier, where survival depends on strength and self-preservation, one man's simple act of kindness would alter the course of history. Jack McMurray was a poor cowboy barely scraping by on a dying ranch, with nothing but dust in his pockets and hope fading from his heart. When he found a starving child wandering alone through the desert, every instinct told him to preserve his scarce resources. But something in those desperate eyes moved him to share his last meal. What Jack didn't know was that this lost boy carried a lineage that commanded the respect of an entire nation. Within 24 hours, the horizon would darken not with storm clouds, but with the silhouettes of 150 mounted warriors riding toward his humble cabin. This is the story of how compassion became currency, how mercy transformed into might, and how one cowboy's humanity sparked an alliance that would echo through generations. Prepare yourself for a tale of honor, survival, and the unexpected bonds that form when worlds collide. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth as Jack McMurray guided his skeletal horse along the dried riverbed that once promised life but now delivered only disappointment. At 43 years old, Jack embodied the weathered resilience of the frontier, his face carved with lines of hardship, his hands calloused from decades of rope and rain, his eyes holding that particular shade of blue that comes from staring too long at impossible horizons. His ranch, if it could still be called that, consisted of 23 acres of stubborn scrubland, a leaning cabin with more holes than walls, and exactly 4 remaining cattle from a herd that had once numbered 50. The drought had been relentless for 3 consecutive seasons, and the bank's patience had worn thinner than the leather on Jack's saddle. He had ridden out that morning with his rifle and his last 2 bullets, hoping to find game but expecting nothing. The rabbits had gone to ground, the deer had migrated to greener territories, and even the rattlesnakes seemed to have abandoned this godforsaken stretch of territory. Jack's stomach had been empty for 2 days save for some hardtack and creek water, and his prospects looked bleaker than the cloudless sky above. He was a man approaching the end of his rope, both figuratively and literally, as even the hemp he used to mend his fences had begun to fray beyond usefulness. The McMurray family had once meant something in these parts. His father had built the ranch from nothing, carving civilization from wilderness with nothing but determination and sweat. His mother had raised 4 sons in that cabin, teaching them to read by candlelight and to ride before they could properly walk. But fever had taken her when Jack was 12, and a falling horse had claimed his father 5 years later. His brothers had scattered to California, to the railroads, to the promise of easier lives elsewhere. Only Jack had remained, stubborn as the mesquite trees that refused to die no matter how long the rains stayed away. He had promised his father he would keep the land, and a McMurray's word was supposed to mean something, even when circumstances made that promise feel like a noose around his neck. It was approaching noon when Jack saw the buzzards circling in the distance, their lazy spirals drawing dark signatures against the pale sky. His first thought was that perhaps they had found something he could salvage, maybe a deer that had succumbed to the heat. But as he urged his reluctant horse closer, he saw something that made his heart clench with an emotion he hadn't felt in years, protective fury mixed with profound sadness. Collapsed beneath a twisted juniper tree was a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, lying motionless in a patch of shade that would disappear within the hour as the sun traveled westward. Jack dismounted faster than his aching joints preferred and knelt beside the child, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for signs of life. The boy's pulse fluttered weakly beneath sun-darkened skin, and his lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. His clothing was strange, not the typical homespun cotton of frontier children, but something crafted from softer hide and decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns Jack didn't recognize, but instinctively understood meant something significant. The boy's long black hair was matted with dust and decorated with a single eagle feather that had somehow remained attached despite what must have been a terrible ordeal. Water first. Jack pulled his canteen from his saddle and carefully trickled liquid between the boy's parched lips, supporting his head and speaking softly in the tone one might use with a spooked horse. The child's eyes fluttered open, briefly dark and deep as wells, and Jack saw in them an intelligence and awareness that seemed too old for such a young face. The boy managed to swallow a few sips before his eyes closed again, but his breathing had already become more regular, less desperate. Jack knew he needed to get this child to shelter immediately. The afternoon heat would kill them both if they stayed exposed much longer. Getting the boy onto his horse proved challenging, as Jack's mount was barely strong enough to carry one rider, let alone two. But Jack managed to secure the child in front of him, holding him steady with one arm while guiding the reins with the other. The ride back to his cabin took twice as long as the journey out, and every minute felt like an hour as Jack worried the boy might slip away before he could provide proper care. He found himself talking to the unconscious child, telling him stories about the land, about the ranch's better days, about anything that might anchor the boy's spirit to the living world. It was foolish, perhaps, but Jack had spent so much time alone that conversation, even one-sided, felt necessary. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had moved considerably, and Jack's arms ached from holding the boy steady. He carried the child inside and laid him on his own straw-filled mattress, the only bed in the single-room structure. He stoked the fire, unnecessary for warmth in the brutal heat, but needed for cooking, and began preparing what food he had left. It wasn't much. Some cornmeal, a handful of dried beans he'd been saving, a few strips of jerky that were more leather than meat, and a precious onion he'd been hoarding for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive. Jack didn't hesitate. He threw everything into a pot with water from his dwindling barrel and let it simmer into something resembling soup. While the food cooked, Jack tended to the boy with surprising skill. Years of nursing injured cattle and once setting his own broken arm had taught him the basics of care. He cleaned the child's face with a damp cloth, noting the high cheekbones and noble features that spoke of proud lineage. The boy's hands, though small, showed calluses that indicated he knew hard work despite his young age. Most telling were the small scars on his arms marks that suggested training in skills most children never learned. This was no ordinary farm boy lost on his way home from town. This child came from somewhere else, from a people with different ways, and Jack understood that finding him out here alone meant something terrible had likely happened. As the afternoon wore into evening, the boy finally woke fully. His eyes opened with startled wariness, the reaction of someone accustomed to danger. But when he saw Jack sitting patiently in a chair across the room, some of that tension eased. Jack smiled gently and brought over a bowl of the warm soup, helping the child sit up and steadying his hands as he ate. The boy consumed the food with desperate hunger, and Jack had to slow him down, knowing that eating too quickly after such deprivation would make him sick. They didn't share a common language, but understanding passed between them through gestures and expressions. The boy pointed to himself and said something that sounded like Tafton, and Jack repeated it carefully, then pointed to himself and said, "Jack." It seemed important to have names, to be people to each other rather than just strangers thrown together by circumstance. That night, Jack gave the boy more water and the last of the food, insisting through gestures that the child needed it more. He sat by the fire as Tahatan finally fell into a deep, healing sleep, and Jack allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had probably just fed this boy his last meal. The cupboard was now completely bare, and he had no money to purchase more supplies. The bank would seize his property within weeks. He had just given away everything he had to save a child he didn't know and couldn't communicate with, a child who would probably be gone by morning, trying to find his way back to wherever he came from. By any practical measure, Jack had just made a terrible decision. But as he looked at the sleeping boy's peaceful face, watched his small chest rise and fall with steady breathing, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose, worth, the bone-deep satisfaction that comes from doing something right regardless of the cost. He had saved a life today, and whatever else happened, no one could take that away from him. As exhaustion finally claimed him and he dozed in his chair, Jack had no idea that his simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would change everything. The boy sleeping in his bed was no ordinary lost child, and by morning, the entire landscape of Jack's world would transform in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Dawn arrived with unusual sounds that pulled Jack from his uncomfortable sleep in the chair. His back screamed in protest as he straightened, reminding him that he wasn't a young man anymore, and sleeping in furniture wasn't something his body tolerated gracefully. But the aches faded to insignificance as he registered what had woken him: the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, dozens of them, growing louder by the second. Jack's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, that frontier reflex that had kept him alive through Indian raids, bandit attacks, and claimed jumpers over the years. But something stopped him from reaching for the weapon. Perhaps it was the memory of the boy's peaceful sleeping face, or perhaps it was simply that after yesterday's decision to give away everything he had, fighting seemed pointless. If trouble was coming, he was too empty to resist it anyway. He moved to the cabin's small window and felt his breath catch in his chest. The horizon had transformed into something from legend or nightmare, depending on one's perspective. Warriors on horseback, at least 100 of them, possibly more, were approaching in a formation that spoke of military precision and undeniable purpose. They wore traditional dress, elaborate headdresses, ceremonial paint, and carried weapons that ranged from rifles to traditional lances and bows. The morning sun caught on metal ornaments and beadwork, creating a display that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. At the front of this impressive force rode a man who could only be a chief, his bearing radiating authority and power that needed no crown or title to be recognized. He was perhaps 50 years old, his face carved with the kind of lines that come from leadership and responsibility, wearing a headdress of eagle feathers that proclaimed his rank more effectively than any European medal or uniform ever could. Jack's mind raced through possibilities. Had he unknowingly stumbled into tribal territory? Was the boy someone important, someone whose disappearance had triggered this massive response? His hand remained steady despite his racing heart. Years of facing death had taught him that panic killed faster than bullets. He glanced back at Tahaddan, who had woken and was now sitting up in bed, his young face showing no fear at the approaching sounds, only calm recognition. The boy stood and walked to the window with a steadiness that hadn't been there yesterday, peering out at the approaching riders. Then he turned to Jack with an expression of profound seriousness and spoke words in his language that Jack could not understand, but whose meaning felt clear anyway. Everything would be all right. The riders surrounded the cabin in a perfect circle, their horses snorting and stamping but completely under control. The discipline was impressive, the kind that came from years of training and unwavering respect for leadership. Not a single warrior raised a weapon or made a threatening gesture, though the sheer display of force would have been enough to make any man's knees weak. Jack stepped outside slowly, keeping his hands visible and empty, positioning himself between the cabin and the mounted force in an instinctive, protective gesture toward the child inside. The chief guided his magnificent black stallion forward, his dark eyes studying Jack with an intensity that felt like being examined down to the soul. This was a man accustomed to reading people, to seeing through deception and measuring worth in a glance. The chief spoke in his native tongue, his voice deep and carrying natural authority. Jack shook his head apologetically, spreading his hands to indicate he didn't understand. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled with the soft sounds of horses and the whisper of morning wind through the dry grass. Then Tahaddan appeared in the doorway, and the effect on the assembled warriors was immediate and profound. Several made exclamations, and Jack saw relief wash over faces that had been stone-hard moments before. The boy ran to the chief, who dismounted with fluid grace and caught the child in an embrace that told Jack everything he needed to know about their relationship. This was the boy's father, and the love between them was evident in every line of their bodies as they held each other. What happened next surprised Jack more than anything else that morning. The chief turned to him, and instead of the anger or suspicion Jack might have expected, the man's eyes held something that looked like deep respect. Another warrior, younger than the chief, but bearing himself with similar authority, dismounted and approached Jack. This man spoke, and to Jack's surprise, his English was clear, though accented with the cadence of one who had learned it as a second language. The warrior introduced himself as Red Hawk, the chief's brother and translator, and explained that Jack stood before Chief Gray Wolf of the Lakota people, a leader whose name carried weight across dozens of tribes and whose diplomatic skills had prevented countless conflicts between his people and the encroaching settlers. Through Red Hawk's translation, Chief Gray Wolf spoke, and his words carried a weight that made Jack's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The chief explained that Tahatan was not just his son, but his youngest and most beloved child, born to him late in life when he had thought he would have no more children. 3 days ago, the boy had been traveling with a small group to visit relatives in another camp when they had been attacked by a rival faction, warriors who opposed the chief's peaceful policies and sought to start war by killing his son. The escorts had fought bravely. All had died protecting Tahatan, but the boy had managed to escape into the wilderness. For 3 days and nights, over 200 warriors had been searching every canyon, every valley, every possible hiding place, fearing they would find only the boy's body. The chief's voice cracked slightly as he described the anguish of those days. The wait time had stretched into agony, the prayers offered to every spirit and ancestor for the boy's safe return. Chief Gray Wolf stepped closer to Jack, and now his eyes shone with moisture that he made no attempt to hide. Through Red Hawk, he said that when Tahatan had stumbled into camp just an hour after sunrise, the entire tribe had erupted in celebration and thanksgiving. But the chief's joy had been tempered by his son's story, how he had been near death, how the buzzards had been circling, how a poor white cowboy with nothing to his name had found him and given him everything. The boy had described how Jack had shared his last food, had tended to him through the night, had treated him with the gentleness a father shows a son despite being a complete stranger from a different people. The chief's voice grew stronger as he declared that such compassion transcended tribe and color, that such humanity represented everything the spirits taught but so few practiced. Jack felt his face flush with embarrassment. He hadn't done anything special, just what any decent person would do. He tried to explain this through his stammered responses that Red Hawk translated, saying he had only done what was right, that he couldn't have left a child to die, that it wasn't anything worthy of such attention. But Chief Gray Wolf shook his head firmly and placed both hands on Jack's shoulders in a gesture that felt ceremonial and deeply significant. The chief declared that in his 53 years of life, he had met thousands of men, both from his people and from the white settlements, and most would have ridden past a child who wasn't their own, especially one from a different tribe. Most would have prioritized their own survival, justified their indifference with dozens of reasonable excuses. But Jack had chosen differently, had chosen compassion over self-preservation, and such choices revealed the true measure of a man's spirit. What the chief said next made Jack's heart pound with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Through Red Hawk, Gray Wolf explained that the Lakota people believed in sacred debts, in obligations that went beyond mere gratitude. When someone saved a life, especially the life of a chief's child, that person became family in ways that transcended blood. The debt could never truly be repaid, but honor demanded that the attempt be made. The chief gestured broadly at the assembled warriors and proclaimed that from this moment forward, Jack McMurray was under the protection of the entire Lakota Nation. Any who threatened him would answer to 150 warriors who would ride to his defense as they would for any member of the tribe. Any who wronged him would face justice from a people who had long memories and unwavering loyalty to those they considered their own. Jack stood speechless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. These weren't empty words or symbolic gestures. He could see in the faces of the assembled warriors that this was a sacred vow, something that would be honored with life itself if necessary. Red Hawk continued translating as the chief spoke of practical matters. Gray Wolf had already sent riders to the nearest town with instructions to speak with the bank president. The chief's words carried weight in the region. He had negotiated treaties, prevented wars, and commanded respect even from those who held prejudices against his people. The bank would receive payment in full for Jack's debt, along with enough gold to ensure the ranch could operate for years. Additional warriors would help repair the cabin, restore the fencing, and even bring cattle from the tribe's own substantial herds to rebuild Jack's depleted stock. But beyond the material assistance, what struck Jack most profoundly was when he saw in Chief Gray Wolf's eyes genuine affection and respect, the kind that couldn't be bought or manufactured. This wasn't charity or payment. This was something more fundamental. This was one father recognizing another father's heart in a man who had no children of his own, but had treated someone else as child with the care and sacrifice that defined true parenthood. The chief explained through Red Hawk that Jack would always have a place in the Lakota camps, would be welcome at their fires, would be taught their ways if he wished to learn. Tehadden himself approached Jack and took his hand, speaking in his own language while looking up with eyes full of hero worship and gratitude. Red Hawk translated the boy's words that Tehadden had declared Jack his second father, his protector, his savior, and wanted to visit him often to learn the ways of the cowboys, just as Jack might learn the ways of the Lakota people. Jack felt his eyes burning, a sensation he hadn't experienced since burying his parents decades ago. He had spent so many years alone, surviving but not truly living, watching his dreams crumble like the drought-stricken earth beneath his feet. He had made peace with dying alone on this failing ranch, with being forgotten by a world that had largely forgotten him already. But now standing in the morning light, surrounded by warriors who had pledged their loyalty, holding the hand of a child who looked at him, with love facing a chief who called him brother, Jack felt something shift deep in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. He had never imagined that his simple act of sharing a meal could lead to this, to being adopted into a nation, to finding family among people he had been taught to fear, to discovering that humanity was a language that transcended all the barriers men erected between each other. As the sun climbed higher and the warriors began dismounting to set up a camp near his property, Jack watched Chief Gray Wolf and wondered at the strange paths life could take. Yesterday, he had been a poor cowboy, counting down his final days of independence before losing everything. Today, he stood at the center of something he didn't fully understand, but felt in his bones was significant. The isolation that had defined his life for so long was shattering like sun-baked clay, and something new was growing in its place. Something that looked like hope, felt like family, and promised a future he had stopped believing was possible. The transformation of Jack's property over the following week felt like watching a miracle unfold in real time, though the chief would have said it was simply honor being properly expressed through action. What had been a slowly dying ranch on the edge of collapse became something alive and purposeful as dozens of Lakota workers, men, women, and even children who insisted on helping descended on the land with an energy and skill that left Jack humbled and more than a little overwhelmed. These weren't charity workers going through the motions. Every person who touched his property did so with the seriousness of sacred duty, understanding that they were repaying a debt their chief considered beyond price. The cultural divide that Jack had expected to be insurmountable proved surprisingly easy to bridge when built on foundations of mutual respect and genuine gratitude. The cabin itself was the first priority. What had been a structure barely standing, with walls that let in wind and rain, a roof that leaked like a sieve, and floors so warped that walking across them felt like navigating a ship's deck in rough seas, was stripped down to its essential bones and rebuilt with a craftsmanship that shamed Jack's original construction. The Lakota builders worked with a combination of traditional techniques and adapted frontier methods, creating something that honored both cultures. They replaced rotted timber with strong new wood, reinforced the foundation with stones carefully selected and fitted, and constructed a roof that would shed water for decades. But they also added elements from their own architectural wisdom, strategic positioning that maximized shade during brutal summer months, ventilation systems that pulled hot air out naturally, and decorative elements carved into support beams that told stories and honored the spirits of the land. Jack tried to help at first, but quickly realized he was more hindrance than assistance. These workers moved with synchronized efficiency, born from lifetimes of building for survival in harsh conditions. Instead, he found himself in the unusual position of being a student, watching and learning techniques his father had never taught him. A woman named Singing Wind, who appeared to be about 60 and possessed a seemingly endless supply of patient amusement at Jack's ignorance, took it upon herself to educate him. She spoke no English, but communication happened through demonstration, gesture, and the occasional drawing in the dust. She showed him how to identify which trees would provide the strongest timber, how to treat wood so it would resist rot and insects, how to bind joints so they would hold through decades of temperature extremes. Jack found himself laughing more in those few days than he had in years, usually at his own expense as he fumbled tasks that children performed with casual expertise. The repairs extended far beyond just the cabin. The fencing that had been falling apart, held together more by hope than nails, was completely replaced with new posts and rails that ran straight and true across property lines Jack had almost forgotten he owned. The well that had been producing increasingly muddy water was excavated, cleaned, reinforced with stonework, and suddenly flowed clear and sweet. The small barn that had collapsed 2 winters ago, and which Jack had lacked the resources to rebuild, simply rose again as if the past years of decay had been a bad dream. Warriors who had spent their lives following buffalo herds proved surprisingly skilled with hammer and saw, and several of them seemed to actively enjoy the challenge of frontier construction techniques. A young man named Fast Horse confided through Red Hawk's translation that he found building structures that stayed in one place, oddly satisfying compared to the constant mobility of traditional Lakota life. On the 4th day, Chief Gray Wolf himself arrived with news that made Jack's knees weak with relief and disbelief. The chief had personally ridden to town with 10 of his most imposing warriors, not as a threat, he clarified with a slight smile, but as a diplomatic delegation that ensured his words would be taken seriously. The bank president, a man named Thornton, whom Jack had always found cold and dismissive, had apparently become remarkably cooperative when faced with a Lakota chief whose reputation preceded him. Gray Wolf had not only paid off Jack's entire debt in gold, but had also purchased an additional 200 acres of adjoining land that had belonged to a speculator who was eager to sell to someone with ready money. The papers were all properly filed, the deeds transferred, and Jack now owned nearly 4 times the property he had started with, all of it free and clear of any encumbrance. But the chief's news didn't stop there. He had also established a line of credit at the general store, ensuring Jack could purchase supplies as needed without the humiliation of being turned away for lack of funds. More significantly, Gray Wolf had spoken with several other ranchers in the area, wealthy men who had always been friendly enough to Jack in passing, but had never offered real assistance when his circumstances deteriorated. The chief's presence and his explanation of what Jack had done had shifted something in the town's perception. Suddenly, Jack wasn't just a poor cowboy barely surviving on failing land. He was the man who had saved Chief Gray Wolf's son, the man who had friends powerful enough to reshape the economic landscape. 3 separate ranchers had already approached Red Hawk with offers to purchase beef from Jack's herd once it was reestablished, at prices that were not just fair but generous. Jack listened to all this while sitting on a new chair outside his rebuilt cabin, and the emotional weight of it pressed down on him until he had to put his head in his hands to hide the tears that wouldn't be contained. His entire life had been defined by struggle, by working harder than anyone else just to maintain a baseline existence, by watching opportunities pass him by because he lacked the resources to seize them. He had taught himself to want nothing, to expect nothing, to find satisfaction in simple survival, because anything more seemed like dangerous fantasy. But now, because he had shared a meal with a lost child, everything had changed. The debts that had haunted his dreams were gone. The land he had fought to keep was not only secured but expanded. The respect that had always been withheld was now freely offered. It was too much, too fast, and Jack found himself almost angry at the unfairness of it. Not the unfairness of his new good fortune, but the unfairness that it had taken so long, that he had suffered for so many years when kindness had apparently been the key all along. Chief Gray Wolf sat beside him in that moment, his weathered hand coming to rest on Jack's shoulder with a weight that felt both comforting and grounding. Through Red Hawk, the chief spoke words that Jack would remember for the rest of his life. Gray Wolf said that he understood the overwhelming nature of such rapid change, that he recognized the emotional complexity of receiving help after years of providing only for oneself. But the chief wanted Jack to understand something fundamental. This wasn't charity, and it wasn't payment. This was balance being restored to a world that had become unbalanced. The spirits recognized when someone lived according to the highest principles, even at great personal cost, and they eventually moved to correct the injustice. Jack's years of struggle had not been wasted or meaningless. They had forged him into the kind of man who would save a child despite having nothing to spare. That character, that fundamental decency, was now being honored as it should have been honored all along. The chief's words helped, but what truly settled Jack's turbulent emotions was what happened that evening. Hatton, who had been staying in the Lakota camp that had been established a respectful distance from Jack's property, came running up to the cabin with the boundless energy of a healthy child who had forgotten he had been near death less than a week ago. The boy grabbed Jack's hand and pulled him toward the camp, chattering excitedly in his own language, while Jack laughed and allowed himself to be led like a large, clumsy dog following an enthusiastic puppy. What Jack found at the camp took his breath away. A feast had been prepared in his honor, a celebration that blended Lakota traditions with adaptations, meant to make him feel welcome and included. The cooking fires had been built up large, and the smells of roasting meat, corn cakes, and various dishes Jack couldn't identify, but which made his mouth water filled the evening air. Someone had erected a special seat for him, decorated with carefully arranged blankets and positioned to indicate respect without separating him from the community. As Jack was guided to this place of honor, every member of the camp, from the oldest grandmother to the smallest child, made some gesture of acknowledgement. Some touched his hand as he passed. Others spoke words he couldn't understand, but whose warm tone needed no translation. And several of the warriors clasped his forearm in the grip of equals that needed no shared language to convey respect. The meal itself was unlike anything Jack had experienced. The variety and abundance would have been impressive by any measure, but what struck him most was the care that had gone into preparation. This wasn't just food. This was art, culture, and communication, all served on wooden plates and shared between people who had been strangers days ago, but who now treated each other as family. Chief Gray Wolf explained through Red Hawk that the Lakota believed food shared with intention carried blessings, that meals taken together in celebration strengthened not just bodies, but the bonds between souls. Every dish had significance. The buffalo meat represented strength and the ongoing connection between the people and the land that sustained them. The corn honored the three sisters and the agricultural wisdom passed down through generations. The berries symbolized the sweetness of life when lived in harmony with natural law. As the feast progressed and the evening deepened, warriors began telling stories. Red Hawk translated most of them for Jack's benefit. Tales of hunts and battles, of ancestors and spirits, of lessons learned and wisdom gained. But then something unexpected happened. Several of the younger warriors began asking Jack questions about his life, about cowboy skills, about the techniques of managing cattle and surviving on the frontier. What started as simple curiosity evolved into a genuine exchange of knowledge. Jack found himself demonstrating how to throw a lasso, laughing as his first attempts missed dramatically, while warriors who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop struggled to master the rotating loop of rope. Fast Horse proved particularly enthusiastic, declaring through translation that he would become the first Lakota cowboy, a statement that earned him good-natured ribbing from his companions, but also genuine interest in the possibility. As the fire burned lower and the stars emerged in their countless thousands, painting the sky with the kind of glory that made men feel, both small and connected to something infinite, Chief Gray Wolf stood and spoke to the assembled gathering. His words carried the weight of formal pronouncement, and Red Hawk's translation made clear that this was not casual conversation, but official declaration. The chief proclaimed that from this night forward, Jack McMurray would be known among the Lakota as he who shares his last, a name that honored his willingness to give everything to save a child. This name would be carried in their oral histories, would be taught to children not yet born, would become part of the permanent record of their people. More than that, Gray Wolf declared that the alliance between Jack and the Lakota Nation was now sealed in ceremony and witnessed by the spirits. Any who rode against Jack would find themselves facing the combined might of the tribe. Any who honored Jack honored the Lakota people. Any who called Jack friend could count on being received as friend by the nation. The warriors responded with a chant that raised the hair on Jack's arms, a sound that was simultaneously beautiful and fierce, musical and martial. Tahatin climbed into Jack's lap unselfconsciously, the way a child settles into a parent's embrace, and Jack's arms closed around the boy automatically. In that moment, surrounded by people who had been strangers, but were now family, holding a child who looked at him with uncomplicated love, watched over by a chief who had proclaimed him brother, Jack felt something he had thought lost forever belonging. He belonged here, in this circle of firelight, among these people who measured worth not by land owned or money accumulated, but by actions taken when no one was watching and nothing would be gained. Jack had spent his entire adult life alone, and he suddenly understood that loneliness had been a form of poverty more devastating than financial hardship. But that poverty had ended. He was rich now in ways that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with connection, with being seen and valued, with mattering to people who mattered to him in return. The integration of Jack's life with the Lakota community deepened over the following months in ways that surprised everyone, including Jack himself. What had begun as a grateful tribe, assisting a man who had saved their chief's son, evolved into something more complex and mutually beneficial, a genuine friendship between cultures that found more common ground than either side had anticipated. The Lakota camp near Jack's property became semi-permanent, with about 30 people maintaining a presence that rotated periodically as different families came to participate in what Gray Wolf was calling the Bridge Project. The chief had recognized that Jack's Ranch could serve as a literal and figurative bridge between the Lakota Nation and the growing settler population, a place where peaceful exchange could happen away from the tensions and prejudices that plagued both the towns and the reservation territories. Jack found himself learning at a pace that would have exhausted a younger man. Singing Wind had taken her role as his cultural educator seriously, and hardly a day passed without her introducing him to some new aspect of Lakota life. She taught him words and phrases in her language, laughing delightedly when his pronunciation mangled meanings and turning simple vocabulary lessons into comedy routines that had the whole camp entertained. She showed him how to read weather signs that went beyond the frontier wisdom his father had taught, subtle indicators in animal behavior, in the quality of morning light, in the way certain plants responded to approaching changes. She explained the complex kinship structures that governed Lakota society, the obligations and connections that made their people something more than just individuals sharing space. What fascinated Jack most was realizing that while the surface details looked different from white society, the underlying principles were remarkably similar. Both cultures valued family, honored those who sacrificed for others, and struggled with how to balance individual needs against community welfare. In return, Jack found himself serving as a cultural interpreter for the Lakota people, who wanted to understand the settler economy and the strange ways white men organized their lives. Fast Horse practically lived at the ranch now, fascinated by every aspect of cowboy existence and determined to master skills that bridged both worlds. The young warrior proved a quick study with horses, though his riding style, developed from years on the plains hunting buffalo, had to be adapted for the different demands of managing cattle. Jack and Fast Horse developed a teaching relationship that flowed both directions. The Lakota warrior showed Jack advanced horsemanship techniques that made his frontier skills look clumsy in comparison, while Jack taught Fast Horse the economics of ranching, the paperwork requirements of legal land ownership, and the social expectations that governed interactions in town. The ranch itself was thriving in ways Jack had never imagined possible. The cattle that Chief Gray Wolf had provided as part of the initial assistance had been supplemented by the 3 yearlings Jack had managed to keep alive through the drought, and the combined herd had grown to nearly 40 head. More significantly, the addition of Lakota breeding stock animals descended from lines that had been carefully managed for generations to thrive in harsh prairie conditions, produced offspring that seemed almost supernaturally healthy and resilient. Fast Horse explained that his people had been selectively breeding horses for specific traits for longer than white men had been on the continent, and they applied similar principles to the cattle they had acquired over the years. The results spoke for themselves. Jack's herd was becoming the envy of the county, with several neighboring ranchers asking pointed questions about his sudden success. This success, however, came with complications. Not everyone in the surrounding communities viewed the Lakota presence near Jack's ranch with approval or even tolerance. There had always been tensions between settlers and the indigenous peoples, years of conflict and broken treaties, creating deep reservoirs of mistrust and hostility on both sides. Many of the townspeople, particularly the newer arrivals who had never interacted with native peoples beyond fearful stories, viewed the Lakota camp with suspicion bordering on alarm. Rumors began circulating in town, wild tales, that Jack was being held hostage, that the Indians were using his ranch as a staging ground for raids, that weapons were being stockpiled for an uprising. The fact that none of these rumors had any basis in reality did nothing to slow their spread, and Jack found himself facing hostile questions whenever he rode into town for supplies. The situation came to a head on a warm afternoon in late spring when Jack was at the general store settling his account. A man named Coleman, who owned a large ranch to the south and had a reputation for both wealth and prejudice, confronted Jack in front of a dozen witnesses. Coleman was in his late 50s, thick-bodied and red-faced, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. He announced loudly that Jack was a disgrace to white settlers, that his fraternizing with savages was putting the whole county at risk, and that decent people were getting tired of seeing Indians treated like they had any rights to land that God had clearly intended for Christian civilization. Coleman's words were designed to humiliate and provoke, delivered with the assumption that Jack would either back down or respond with violence that could then be used to justify further action against the Lakota camp. Jack surprised everyone, including himself, with his response. Instead of anger or defensiveness, he felt a calm clarity settle over him like cool water. He looked at Coleman steadily and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the now silent store. He said that it was interesting Coleman brought up Christianity, because Jack seemed to recall the Bible saying something about loving your neighbor, about feeding the hungry, about showing kindness to strangers. He noted that Chief Gray Wolf and his people had shown Jack more Christian charity than anyone in town had managed during his years of struggle. He observed that the Lakota had helped him rebuild his ranch, had paid his debts, had treated him like family, while Coleman and men like him had watched him slowly fail without lifting a finger. And most poignantly, Jack said that if treating people with decency and respect, regardless of their skin color, made him a disgrace, then he would wear that label with more pride than any honor Coleman's approval could convey. The speech wasn't eloquent by educated standards, but it was honest and delivered with conviction that cut through the prejudice in the room. Several of the younger men in the store actually nodded in agreement, and Jack saw the storekeeper, a man named Peterson, who had always been fair, if not particularly friendly, crack a small smile of approval. Coleman's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and for a moment, Jack thought the man might actually swing at him. But Coleman was fundamentally a bully, and bullies rarely follow through when their targets don't show the expected fear. Instead, Coleman spat on the floor near Jack's boots and declared that Jack would regret choosing Indians over his own kind, that there would be consequences for his betrayal of white solidarity. Then Coleman stormed out, leaving a tension in the store that took several minutes to dissipate. Jack finished his business and rode back to the ranch troubled by the encounter, but not particularly surprised. He had known that his alliance with the Lakota would create problems with certain segments of the settler community. What worried him wasn't Coleman as personal hostility. The man was a blowhard who valued his own comfort too much to personally engage in violence. What worried Jack was that Coleman represented a certain viewpoint that was common enough to be dangerous, and that men like him had ways of stirring up trouble without directly dirtying their own hands. Jack's instincts, honed by years of frontier survival, told him that the confrontation in the store was just the beginning of something larger. He was right. Over the next few weeks, small incidents began accumulating in a pattern that was clearly deliberate. Fence posts on the boundary of Jack's property were knocked down, requiring hours of repair work. One of his cattle was found shot, killed by a bullet that had no purpose beyond destruction since the meat was left to rot. Late one night, someone fired several shots in the direction of both the ranch house and the Lakota camp, though whether the intent was to kill or merely intimidate was unclear since the bullets hit nothing but dirt. Fast Horse and several other warriors tracked the shooter back toward Coleman's property, but the trail was lost in rocky ground that made tracking impossible. Chief Gray Wolf, when informed of these incidents, offered to post permanent guards around Jack's ranch, but Jack declined. He understood the chief's protective instinct, but he also knew that a heavy Lakota military presence would only inflame tensions further and potentially give men like Coleman the justification they sought for larger violence. Instead, Jack did something that surprised even Chief Gray Wolf. He called a meeting. Not a private conversation or a small gathering, but a formal, public meeting to which he invited every rancher and property owner within a day's ride, including Coleman. He asked Chief Gray Wolf and a delegation of Lakota leaders to attend as well, promising that all sides would have the chance to speak and be heard. The chief was skeptical that such a meeting would accomplish anything beyond giving Coleman a platform for his prejudices, but he agreed out of respect for Jack's judgment and curiosity about what his friend had planned. The meeting was set for a Sunday afternoon at the small church that served the scattered settler community, neutral ground where violence would be inappropriate, regardless of how heated the discussion became. The day of the meeting arrived with weather that seemed symbolically appropriate, dark clouds on the horizon suggesting a storm approaching, but sunshine directly overhead, creating a contrast between present calm and potential future turbulence. Jack arrived early with Chief Gray Wolf, Red Hawk, and a half-dozen other Lakota leaders, all of whom had dressed in a combination of traditional and adapted clothing that managed to honor their culture while not appearing deliberately confrontational. The church was small, just a wood-frame structure that doubled as a schoolhouse during the week, but it was packed with curious and suspicious settlers by the time the meeting was scheduled to begin. Coleman was there, of course, sitting in the front row with several of his ranch hands, all of them wearing expressions that suggested they had come for entertainment and expected to leave victorious. Jack stood at the front of the room with none of the nervousness that public speaking usually inspired in him. He had spent his entire life working with his hands rather than his words, had always felt more comfortable with cattle and horses than with crowds of people. But standing there with Chief Gray Wolf beside him, Jack felt an odd confidence. He had truth on his side, and after years of struggling alone, he had allies who wouldn't abandon him at the first sign of difficulty. He began simply, thanking everyone for coming and acknowledging that there were tensions in the community that needed to be addressed openly and honestly. He said that he had called this meeting because he believed most people in the room were decent human beings who wanted to do right but were working from incomplete information and justified fears born of past conflicts. Then Jack did something unexpected. He told his story. Not a sanitized version designed to make himself look heroic, but the raw, honest truth of his situation before meeting Tahatan. He described the drought years, the dying cattle, the impossible debts, the humiliation of watching his family's legacy crumble, while neighbors who could have helped chose not to. He talked about finding the dying child and making the decision to share his last food, not because he expected any reward, but because leaving that boy to die would have meant losing the last piece of his own humanity. He described waking to find 150 warriors surrounding his cabin and his terror that quickly transformed into astonishment as he learned who the child was and what his simple act of kindness meant to these people. Jack's voice grew stronger as he described what happened next, how the Lakota had rebuilt his ranch, paid his debts, expanded his land, and treated him with more loyalty and generosity than he had ever experienced from his own culture. He emphasized that this wasn't charity but honor, the fulfillment of sacred obligations that the Lakota took as seriously as any legal contract signed in a bank. He pointed out that his ranch was now the most productive in the county, that his cattle were thriving, that he had gone from facing foreclosure to having a secure future entirely because of Lakota assistance. And he challenged everyone in the room to consider what kind of people would do all of that for a stranger, simply because he had shown kindness to one child. The room had gone completely silent, and Jack could see that his words were having an effect. Several of the settlers looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing themselves in his description of neighbors who had watched him struggle without offering help. Even Coleman's expression had shifted from smugness to something harder to read. Jack wasn't finished. He spoke next about the Lakota people themselves, inviting Red Hawk to translate so that Chief Gray Wolf and the other leaders could hear what he was saying about them. Jack described Singing Wind's patient teaching, fast horses' enthusiastic embrace of cowboy skills, the warrior culture that valued honor and courage and loyalty above personal gain. He talked about sitting around Lakota cooking fires and realizing that the things they cared about, family, land, honor, future generations, were exactly the same things the settlers cared about, just expressed through different customs and traditions. Then Jack's tone shifted to something harder, more challenging. He said that he understood fear, understood that there had been violence and betrayal on both sides of the cultural divide. But he asked the assembled settlers to consider who was actually threatening whom in this specific situation. The Lakota hadn't stolen anyone's land, hadn't burned anyone's buildings, hadn't shot anyone's cattle. But someone had done all those things to him, and the timing of those attacks coinciding with his alliance with Chief Gray Wolf suggested those actions were not random crime, but deliberate attempts to punish him for crossing racial boundaries. Jack's eyes found Coleman as he said this, and though he didn't speak the man's name, everyone in the room understood who he was talking about. Jack concluded with a proposal. He suggested that instead of viewing the Lakota presence as a threat, the community should recognize it as an opportunity. The tribe had skills, knowledge, and resources that could benefit everyone. Chief Gray Wolf was interested in establishing peaceful trade relationships, in teaching willing students about animal husbandry techniques that had been refined over centuries, in preventing conflicts before they started through regular communication and mutual understanding. Jack's ranch could serve as a neutral meeting ground where both cultures could interact without the baggage of broken treaties and violent history overwhelming every conversation. But this could only work if the settler community was willing to set aside prejudices and judge the Lakota by their actual actions rather than fearful assumptions. The speech ended, and for a long moment nobody moved or spoke. Then Peterson, the storekeeper, stood up. He cleared his throat awkwardly and said that Jack had given him a lot to think about, that he had been guilty of viewing all Indians as dangerous savages, despite never having actually met any who had treated him poorly. He said that Jack's success was visible to anyone with eyes, and that refusing to acknowledge the Lakota's role in that success simply because of their race seemed not just wrong but stupid. Peterson proposed that the community at least try Jack's suggestion, give the peaceful coexistence a genuine chance, and judge the results after a reasonable period, rather than condemning the experiment before it started. Several other settlers stood to voice support, most of them younger men who seemed less invested in old prejudices and more interested in practical outcomes. A few spoke against the proposal, their objections rooted in fear and distrust that decades of conflict had embedded deeply. But even these dissenting voices were more measured than Jack had expected, more willing to be persuaded by evidence than he had feared. The momentum in the room was shifting, and Jack could see in Chief Gray Wolf's eyes that the chief recognized it too. This wasn't total victory, but it was progress, a crack in the wall of hostility through which light might eventually pour. Then Coleman stood, and the room fell silent again. Everyone expected an explosion of rhetoric, a forceful rejection of everything Jack had proposed. But Coleman surprised them all. His face was still flushed, and his posture was defensive, but when he spoke, his voice was controlled. He said that he didn't like what Jack was proposing, didn't trust Indians, and thought the whole arrangement was dangerous. But he also admitted, grudgingly, that Jack had guts for standing up to him in the store and for calling this meeting despite knowing how many people would oppose him. Coleman said that he wouldn't interfere with Jack's ranch or the Lakota camp, wouldn't engage in any more incidents like the ones that had been happening. He made no promises about friendship or cooperation, but his commitment to leave Jack alone represented a de-escalation that felt like victory given the circumstances. The meeting ended without perfect resolution, but with something perhaps more valuable a beginning. As people filed out, several settlers approached Chief Gray Wolf directly, their initial hesitation giving way to curiosity. Small conversations started, tentative questions were asked and answered, and the possibility of coexistence became slightly more real. Jack watched all of this with a feeling he couldn't quite name, something between relief and pride and exhausted hope. The crisis hadn't been completely averted, but it had been confronted rather than ignored, and that felt like its own kind of triumph.